Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the State of the Economy podcast. I'm your host, Ayushi, and today we are going to be unpacking the digital regulatory landscape that is sort of evolving in the telecom and OTT space in India. With us, we have an esteemed guest, Mr. Rentala Chandrashekhar. He is the former president of Nasscom and the former secretary to the Indian Department of Information Technology, as well as a former secretary to the Department of Telecommunications. Mr. Chandrashekhar, sir, is a former IAS officer, and he has had a distinguished career in the government in a variety and has served in a variety of capacities in the technology space. So, sir, we're very honored to have you. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ayushi.
So basically, we're at crossroads as far as regulations are concerned, and we have a lot of things that the TRAI and the DOT has to decide on in relation to the industry of communications. That goes from net neutrality to satellite communications to even the implications of PDP bill on the telecom and the technology industry. I would love to get your opinion around the debate around net neutrality, which has been obviously ongoing for nearly a decade. But recently, telcos have repeated their demands for network fee for OTT players, especially as streaming services are becoming more proliferous in the ecosystem. Do you think that in the current paradigm, with the way 5G is shaping and the difficulty that telecom operators have in monetization of 5G, there is a need for a network fee for telecom operators to survive? Or do you think they have not been very agile in sort of contemplating monetization models?
It's a very interesting question. And sometimes even the nexus between these two, that is between net neutrality on the one hand and OTT players being charged a network fee by the telcos, the relationship between these two is also often not very clearly recognized. But I think this is a particularly important issue. And the debate on net neutrality was at a crescendo some time ago, and then it faded. And now again, in the context of perhaps the new telecom bill and several other things, that has resurfaced. Now, why this, first of all, why this is important is that, the telcos' argument has been that they make a lot of investment in the infrastructure, which is true, that there is a fairly long gestation period to recover that money, which is also true, and that continuous changes in technology, 4G, 5G, 6G, and so on, call for fresh and continuous investment, which is also true, and that they operate under a fairly tight regulatory environment and pay heavy license fee and spectrum charges and so on to the government. And from their perspective, the OTT players are coming in with no contribution financially to the underlying infrastructure and are able to generate a whole lot of revenues from either from their subscribers or more often from advertisements, etc. So I think that's why this asymmetry, as seen by the telecom players, leads to this demand. However, I think this has to be looked at from certain different angles. First of all, the telecom operators are actually performing a different function from the OTT players. In a sense, one is the carrier and the other is the content. Carriage and content are essentially what they both represent. And therefore, the fact is that the carriage providers, which is the telcos, they have the flexibility to decide on the fee that they will charge for the carriage. Now, their demand to be able to charge a fee to the OTT players means that they can charge differentially to different OTT players. And the obvious implication is that if some OTT players are either not paying or don't come on the paying category, or they are paying a little less, they can be disadvantaged in terms of carriage by either slowing them down or reducing the performance there. whereas those which are paying a large fee can be speeded up and can be made more easily and more reliably available to a subscriber. All of this means that instead of subscribers deciding which kind of OTT content they want to use, which one they prefer, and which one brings them more value, the telco will have a role in tilting this balance. Whereas the principle of net neutrality is that the user has to decide, and the user should have access to all content on an equal basis, so that these decisions are taken by the subscribers themselves. So this ability or this demand to charge a network fee actually carries with it the implication that they can alter this balance, and that in turn affects the net neutrality, and users will therefore in some indirect way get a more filtered view than what would be available in a neutral environment. Now, coming to the question of what is the economic compulsion, forget about this neutrality part and the principle involved there. But if you come to the financials, it's a fact that telecom operators have been under pressure. In fact, in the not so distant past, some of them shuttered down, they incurred deep losses and so on. And in a time of hyper competition which existed between 2008 and 2012, in fact, they were forced to drop their rates to 1/3 of what was prevailing before that. And that led to actually many of them shuttering down, because some of the competitors at that time were only interested in getting subscribers, and they were only interested in valuations and not in revenues or profitability. So the conditions were such, and the telcos had to drop their charges. But later conditions changed. After the Supreme Court order in 2012, a lot of telcos went out of the game. Then later there was consolidation and the number of players dropped, and they were able to raise their rates significantly. And this came on the back of a tremendous increase in the consumption, the traffic which was getting generated, because India is the largest and certainly one of the largest in the world in terms of the per capita consumption of data. So when these conditions changed, I think they have been able to change the rates. And now I think we can all see that the telcos are profitable and their business is profitable. But notwithstanding that, I think the fact that OTTs are able to skim a lot of revenues without contributing to the capital investment in the telecom infrastructure is still something that rankles for some of the telecom service providers. To summarize, I don't believe that whatever problems may exist because of the market conditions or the evolution of telecom technology, that this is going to be an elegant solution of allowing the telcos to charge OTT players a network fee over and above whatever subscription fee they charge from users, because that has other unintended consequences which I think are not at all desirable. And the last point I'll make is that it also has an adverse effect on innovation, because established players would then build relationships with the telcos, and a new entrant, even if it is an innovative OTT player, would find that it is very difficult to penetrate all of this and get access, and would have to spend a lot of money just on ensuring that access to their services becomes easy. And that obviously has an adverse effect on innovation. So from every angle, I believe that this is not a good idea.
So with the net neutrality debate, I think people are looking at it from two sides. One is obviously a free-for-all internet, which is what OTT players want, which is what the startups, kind of the the remnant of the Save the Internet movement kind of wrote to TRAI about, of like the fundamental sort of hindrance that a discussion around these network fee, or even a limited application of the network fee that is asked by telcos could have on innovation, as you pointed out. And obviously you have telcos sort of charging a particular network or desiring to charge a particular network fee, but they're also sort of including those caveats around that we only want to do it for big OTT players, and we want to create a threshold, and we do not necessarily want to target startups, etc., or burgeoning sort of enterprises in the internet space. Those are the kind of two sides to this debate. But do you think that, given that there is an economic argument for telcos to get better monetization from the enterprise side, do you think that there's an elegant solution where a regulator can likely step in to regulate these OTT players? I mean, the government has been flirting with the idea of regulating, particularly communication OTTs, for at least since the inception of when the thinking around the telecom bill sort of started, and this debate has been ongoing for a year. Do you think that could be an elegant sort of third way to potentially get operators some relief financially?
Well, I think that one has to think very carefully about injecting regulation into a space, because regulation is not always the panacea which it might appear to be, because it comes with a lot of other baggage. And it's also not entirely correct to say that the internet is completely unregulated and that there is, it's a free for all, because there are certain regulations which apply under notably under the IT Act and the Digital India Act, which is in the pipeline or in the works. So there are certain guardrails over there also, and some of this is through self-regulation. For example, a lot of the platforms have fairly robust technologies aimed at preventing child pornography from appearing on their platform. Similarly, in the regulation, there are various provisions which cast an onus on people who are putting in highly objectionable content and which cause damage. So there are those kind of regulations, but they are very different from the kind of regulations which telecom operators operate, because telecom operators operate by and large within the territorial space of India, including even the wireless communication. The only exception perhaps may be satellite, but even there are various choke points which give the government a degree of control. However, when it comes to content, it's a truly globalized environment. And there, it's not only the question of how you control it, but also how you enforce it. And as far as the telcos asking for parity between communication service providers, think WhatsApp, think Zoom, think TikToks and the variety. So all of these, I think, are seen in a sense as competitors, but actually they are not. As I said, the telecom players are in the business of transporting bits and bytes from one point to another, whereas the OTT players, including the so-called communication providers among the OTT players, the ones who I mentioned, they are in the business of converting those bits and bytes into meaningful content and meaningful services for the subscribers. So they are in complementary spaces, not in identical spaces. And I think that, the moment you bring in licensing, then that has a lot of other implications in terms of how quickly the technology can adapt, how quickly the business models can adapt, and how you will balance between domestic players and global players, because global players are not going to be subject to the same kind of controls. So I think that these are some of the issues which need to be considered carefully. The whole digital space in India is, at the nascent stage in terms of regulation. We've just had the first major regulation, the DPDP Act being passed. The Telecom Act or Telecom Bill rather is still in the pipeline. The DIA is still in the pipeline. The competition, regulation as far as the digital space is concerned, there's a debate going on around it. The e-commerce policy is awaited. So there are a whole lot of regulatory stuff which is still not very clear. And therefore, I think these principles will have to be kept in mind. And I don't think that just because a certain part of this ecosystem, the digital ecosystem, is perhaps financially less rewarding, is enough of a reason to introduce artificial changes in the way that these segments interact with each other. Digital has always caused disruption, and the disruption has always reset equations. That's never going to be easy. And people who are disadvantaged by the digital revolution will always, try and find a workaround against the changes that are happening. But I think that is perhaps, not the right way to deal with these issues, in my opinion.
Of course. So you mentioned satellites, and that is another area of concern for telecom operators, particularly Reliance Jio and to a certain level Vodafone, which is that now we are also seeing potentially satellites entering into communications in a very real way. There was a news story. I mean, obviously you have Elon Musk's Starlink and Sunil Bharti Mittal's OneWeb that have sort of expressed interest in sort of serving a role in communications in India, from broadband to backhaul services. But now even Amazon has also applied for the licensing to enter into the India market. So there are some big names entering into the communication space through the satellite route. And that has sort of initiated the debate around how spectrum should be allocated. Where do you think the chips should fall in this particular debate? Do you think that there needs to be auction for satellite spectrum, and or do you think it should be assignment? And do you think that this current debate that's been going on for 2 years is sort of holding back from the satellite space from sort of ballooning or sort of proliferating in a way it should ideally have, if like this whole debate was not there and telcos were not kind of stopping entry in a way?
Yeah, well, yes, this is in a sense a byproduct of the whole debate on spectrum auctions, which took place almost a decade ago, and where the Supreme Court passed a certain judgment and indicated that auction should be the preferred way. But at the same time, that judgment was in a certain context and for a certain kind of spectrum. And the advice that auction should be the preferred way has to be seen in that context. But I think when you look at the whole issue, the question is that in a different context, and when we are talking here about satellite spectrum, we are talking about, first of all, space, which earlier was a government monopoly. Space was reserved for the government, and therefore it was largely an intra-governmental transaction whether or not the space agency, that is ISRO, was charged or not charged for the spectrum. So it really didn't arouse much public interest. But now that the space sector has been opened up, there are different players coming in with different kinds of products and different kinds of satellites using different technologies. That debate has once again got ignited, because once again you have competing private players, you have a whole lot of innovation happening, and it's a combination of global and domestic issues. So in a sense, it is the same spectrum issues redux. But I think the question is, when you look back at some of the lessons learned from the experience of the past in spectrum, it is that, when you auction spectrum, there are two things that happen. It's not just that you realize the price. You discover a price which the market is willing to pay for it, and it also decides who gets the spectrum, namely the one who is willing to pay that highest price. Now, for a well-developed market, the competitive landscape may be very clear, and the different trade-offs may be clear, and there is probably no easier way or no obvious way in which you can have a fair allocation and a fair price amongst all the players who are there. So, in the absence of any such fair options, administrative allocation was perhaps the only solution. However, it's also important to remember that in the early days of telecom, the early 2000s, at that time, there were very few players. Spectrum was available for the asking, and an administrative allocation made a lot of sense in the very early days, because that was the time when it was lying around. There were very little users, very few subscribers. And even if you had an auction, what would you get? Because whatever price you fixed as the base price is the price that you would realize. Something that has happened later as well. In the case of satellite spectrum, we are at a very nascent stage in the development. And there are different groups coming with different technologies. There are different kinds of applications. There's a mix of government and non-government agencies. And I think we don't quite know how this whole equation is playing out and whether we are in a hugely demand surplus situation or whether there is a hugely demand deficit situation in terms of the entire satellite spectrum that is available. So I think it is probably worth looking at how do you allocate spectrum through different means for different purposes, at least in the initial stage, till you start getting a better understanding of the commercial dimensions, the technology dimensions, and the competitive aspects of satellite services. And as that becomes clear, when the competitive landscape becomes clearer and these trade-offs become clear, then one could move with the benefit of that knowledge into an auction-based process. So in other words, what I'm suggesting is that it's important to test the waters, and that testing of the waters need not necessarily be through an auction process. And the auction process could follow at a later point, because if you start the auction process right away, the first question that arises is, how do you set the base price? Who sets the base price? What evidence do you have to decide what's a reasonable price? What's a reasonable price for one kind of player providing one kind of service using one kind of technology may be completely unaffordable for some other player who is providing an invaluable service which is not identical. So I think there are lots of these kinds of questions which are still hanging in the air, and therefore using a one-size-fits-all approach and without any clear understanding of what you are foregoing in order to gain what is perhaps not the best approach. And finally, I would think that maximizing revenue is important, and clearly that cannot be brushed aside. But there are larger gains and larger benefits at stake here, which also have to be kept in mind. And therefore, that's the trade-off. And for a country like India with very different needs and a very strong IT industry and a very strong innovation ecosystem, which is growing by leaps and bounds, it's important to ensure that the multiplier effect is maximized before the direct benefit is targeted. That would be my 2 bits on this.
Right. So I would just like to conclude it on the possible implications of the PDP bill. I mean, as you pointed out, of the 4 kind of laws that this government is envisioning to regulate this digital economy, the PDP bill has been the first to be passed, and the IT ministry is obviously sort of writing down the exact rules and how those will be implemented. I just wanted to understand, how do you envision that the implications of the PDP bill playing out for telcos? Is there going to be any impact for the direct communications industry, which is the pipeline through which all this internet, etc., is being proliferated around the country, or do you think that the regulations will sort of target internet companies the most? Is that, I mean, I essentially just wanted to understand if there is anything that
Well,
operators will be sort of subject to. Yeah.
well, the DPDP bill itself starts with the statement of objects and reasons, which actually indicates that it's a bill aimed at enabling processing of digital data, having due regard to privacy. So in this case, I think that the DPDP Act, which it is now that it has been passed, actually lays down the boundary conditions. And one of the very good things that it has done is to make the Act simple and easy to understand and relegate much of the detail to the rules. The advantage of this is that you don't need to go about amending the Act every time something changes. And the principles are reasonably clear. There may be one or two areas where there are some deficiencies in terms of the balance between detail in the Act and relegating details to the rules. For example, perhaps some more detail of the Data Protection Board could have been there, some more detail in terms of what the do's and don'ts with regard to digital intermediaries who collect data can do with regard to passing it on to third parties is concerned. But I think aside from that, it's a step in the right direction, because the digital regulation, as I said, is not always a complete blessing, because it can bring in constraints which have other ramifications, whether it is in terms of restricting innovation, raising prices, or limiting the services, and so on. So I think that balance works differently for different countries. So we can't just say, okay, let's adopt the European regulations, or let's just adopt the US regulations, or let's go the Chinese way. That doesn't work, because we have to look at our own ecosystem and our own environment. And I think that's the tricky balance that the government has tried to find, and leaving enough room for agility as we go forward. Has it done enough in the Act itself to remove regulatory uncertainty? I would say to a large extent, yes. And some of it may still come only after the rules come in. So in terms of how it would affect telcos, I don't think that the telcos themselves would be impacted to the same extent as, let us say, the content providers or the OTT providers, and especially the systemically important digital intermediaries, or the SIDIs as they are called, because the onus on them to protect privacy and the data is certainly going to be set at a higher level, and some combination of self-regulation and government regulation would emerge from as the rules get set. So I think that it is more the OTT and the content providers who would get impacted, and the kind of services which can be provided, how this plays out, for example, and sectoral differences, how this plays out in the healthcare space, how this plays out in other areas where personally identifiable information is involved, sensitive data is involved. How it will impact, for example, educational content where children are involved, and how the age gating will actually play out. All of which have been, provisions have been brought in, but I think the exact form after the rules are set out will perhaps give greater clarity. And I think that step, this whole step of bringing in the DPDP Act was absolutely essential in order to enable the digital environment to not be the Wild West that you were talking about, but to actually have clear guardrails which are set out and which can keep getting shifted and adjusted as societal needs change, as technology evolves, and as innovation proceeds apace, and as the whole geopolitical fabric which affects the way the global ecosystem evolves at the backdrop of the Indian digital space. All of these, I think, will witness continuous flux as we go forward. But this is an important and a good first step. The principle of light touch regulation, simple, easy to understand regulation, which I understand the PM himself had desired, I think is the right way to do it. And so the first step, I think, has been taken and taken well.
Okay. Thank you so much for spending time with us too. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Ayushi.
Yeah.